In the spring of 1829, a tenant farmer plowing his small patch of rented land near the Virginia-Carolina border unearthed something that should have never seen the light again. His mare had halted mid-furrow, legs trembling as the soil beneath her gave way. The farmer dismounted, believing he'd struck a sinkhole or rotted tree stump. But what his spade uncovered was the corner of an old wooden chest buried deep in the clay. The box was heavy, sealed tight by damp and time, and when pried open, the stench that rose from it drove him staggering backward. Inside lay bones, yellowed and fragile, arranged as though once packed with care. The skull bore a deep fracture, as if from the swing of an axe. When the sheriff was summoned, his men found not just one grave, but several. Within a week, the same patch of farmland yielded 7 bodies, 4 adults and 3 children, all reduced to bone and horror. The remains told of violence, skulls shattered, ribs crushed, teeth broken, and every grave whispered one name, one that had already drifted through the borderlands like smoke from a long burning fire. Margaret Doyle, the woman locals once called the mistress of the crossroads. For nearly 20 years, Doyle had ruled a hidden empire along that wild, lawless line separating the Old Dominion from the Carolinas. Her trade was not cotton or tobacco, but flesh. Historians would later call it the Reverse Underground Railroad, a network that captured free black men, women, and children and sold them back into slavery in the Deep South. But beneath the practical evil of commerce lay something darker. Margaret was not content merely to profit from human misery. She was a killer who silenced rivals, witnesses, and even her own captives when they became inconvenient. Court papers from Caroline County still bear her name, charged with 4 murders, though locals whispered of 20, perhaps more. But what no paper captured was the cold efficiency with which she built her domain, or how the landscape itself seemed to conspire in her favor. The region where she lived was perfect for hiding sins. The borderlands were a tangle of pine forest and marsh, rivers that wound through cypress roots and vanished into swamp. It was the kind of place where a scream could dissolve into mist before reaching another soul. 3 counties shared jurisdiction there, Greene in Virginia, Beaufort and Edgefield in Carolina, and none could agree on who owned what. For criminals, it was paradise. If the lawmen from one county came riding, you needed only to step a few paces across a boundary stone to belong to another world. At the heart of this no-man's land lay a crossroads settlement known then as Ward's Hollow, named for the tavern that once stood at its center. The locals called it the Devil's Split, and with reason. From that low-roofed tavern and the handful of cabins surrounding it, Margaret Doyle built one of the most notorious kidnapping rings in American history. She hadn't begun as a monster, or at least no one remembered her that way. Records suggest she came to the border country around 1790. A tall, broad-shouldered woman of perhaps 30, newly married to a small farmer named Thomas Doyle. Some whispered she had come down from Nova Scotia or perhaps the coast of Maine, though her accent gave little clue. Her eyes were steel gray, her hair a severe black, and her temper legendary even then. Neighbors said she worked harder than most men, that she could split logs and plow earth without complaint. Yet behind her coarse strength was an intelligence sharper than any axe. Thomas Doyle was an unremarkable man, mild and pliant. Together they raised a daughter, Ellen, and lived quietly on a patch of land straddling the invisible line between 2 states. Their farmhouse stood alone, 2 stories of weathered wood that looked ordinary enough from the road. But Margaret had ways of reshaping what she owned. She tore up the cellar floor, added walls within walls, and built narrow passages that led nowhere anyone could find. In time, the Doyle house became a warren of secret rooms, spaces made not for storage or safety, but for concealment. The world outside was changing. In 1808, the federal ban on importing enslaved Africans took effect, choking the transatlantic slave trade. But in the cotton fields of Alabama and Mississippi, demand for labor exploded. A healthy young man could fetch over $1,000 in the Deep South, 3 times what he would have cost before. The market's hunger created its own predators, and Margaret Doyle saw opportunity in that hunger. Virginia and the Carolinas were full of free black families by then. men and women who had earned or inherited freedom after the revolution. They lived in uneasy peace, always aware that their liberty existed only on paper. They carried documents everywhere, proof of manumission, certificates signed by white witnesses. Without them, any black person could be taken for a runaway. The laws forbade testimony against white defendants. Even a free man's word meant nothing if his skin was dark. To predators, these were perfect victims. Margaret began small. A stranger came through claiming to be a trader, asking for her husband's help locating a few missing slaves. He offered payment for information, a few coins for anyone willing to guide him through the swamps. Margaret watched and learned. Within a year, she was arranging meetings herself, introducing men to runaways who did not yet know they were to be sold. Her husband died suddenly in 1824. The neighbors buried him on a wet March morning. Noting that Margaret showed no tears, only a tight, satisfied calm. Some whispered she had poisoned him, but no proof surfaced. Widowhood granted her autonomy, and with it, her empire began to grow. She soon found new partners among the rougher element that haunted taverns and back roads. Traders, drifters and outlaws who moved between counties without roots or conscience. Among them was Elias Ward, a tall, red-haired man whose smile carried the same chill as his pistol barrel. He was clever, educated enough to keep records, and already known for buying and selling human beings through the southern states. When he met Margaret, he recognized in her a ruthlessness that mirrored his own. Their partnership began in blood. Elias owned a tavern that sat directly on the border, one half in Virginia, the other in Carolina. The sign above the door read, "Ward's Rest," though no soul ever truly rested there. To travelers it appeared ordinary: ale, food, a place to sleep. But its cellar told another story. Beneath the floorboards lay a labyrinth of brick and timber, chambers soundproofed by thick dirt walls, air shafts cunningly disguised as chimneys. These rooms became holding pens for the captives, men and women stolen from their homes and kept until the next caravan rode south. From this place the gang expanded, weaving a network that stretched from Philadelphia to New Orleans. Their operation grew bold because the world around them allowed it to. White farmers cared little if a free black man vanished from the next town. No one filed reports, no one searched. Local sheriffs were overworked, underpaid, and often complicit. Some even drank at Ward's tavern, blind to the faint cries that sometimes rose from beneath their boots. Margaret thrived amid this indifference. Her appearance alone commanded fear. She was nearly 6 feet tall, her shoulders wide, her hands large and veined like a laborer's. Her voice carried the low rasp of command, a tone that left men uneasy. She walked the property with the gait of someone who owned more than land, someone who believed she owned fate itself. By 1820, her family's entanglement with crime was impossible to disguise. Ellen, her daughter, had married a blacksmith named Henry Branson, a man as cruel as he was cunning. Branson was known for traveling from farm to farm under the guise of work, but his hammer often served another trade. He watched families, noted which children were strong, which parents were poor, which households lacked male protectors. When the right opportunity arose, he returned under cover of darkness with accomplices, dragging his chosen victims from their beds. It was Branson who first introduced murder into the Doyle trade. When a slave trader known as Riggs passed through Ward's Hollow, carrying a pouch of Southern money, Margaret and her circle saw easy profit. They plied him with liquor, pretended friendship, and when he stumbled to his rented room, Branson shot him in the chest. His body was buried behind the tavern, his wagon and horses sold within days. Branson was eventually caught and hanged in 1813, but Margaret escaped punishment. The law never found proof linking her to the killing, and she learned the most important lesson of her life. Power belonged not to those who hid their crimes, but to those who controlled who cared enough to look. After Branson's death, Ellen remarried, this time to Elias Ward himself. The union sealed a partnership that combined Margaret's ferocity with Ward's organization. Under their joint rule, the operation evolved from scattered abductions into an industrial system of human theft. They built hidden rooms, acquired wagons with false compartments, bribed local officials, and developed coded signals to communicate along the route south. Their profits were immense. A single shipment of captives might yield thousands of dollars. Yet money was never Margaret's only motive. She seemed to crave control, the power to decide who lived, who vanished, and who would never be found. Even her own associates feared her. She was known to beat servants half to death for imagined slights, to fire pistols into the air when angered, to boast that no man could hang her because the devil himself held her rope. The slaves and free people of color who lived nearby told stories in whispers. They said the Doyle house had no bottom, that beneath its floors ran tunnels leading to the river. They said Margaret's eyes glowed red by lamplight, that she kept the bones of her enemies in barrels of brine. Superstition mixed with truth until the woman became legend, even before she died. As the 1820s wore on, the kidnappings multiplied. Men vanished from roads between Norfolk and Richmond. Children disappeared from fishing villages along the Albemarle Sound. Entire families were taken, their cabins left open to the night wind. Word reached the city of Raleigh, where Mayor Jonathan Wicks, a Quaker with a conscience sharper than most, began compiling lists of the missing. His findings all pointed to the same region, the same name. And then came the testimony of Lydia Green, a young free woman who vanished in 1825 and was later rescued before she could be sold. Her account, recorded by the mayor's clerks, would expose horrors few dared imagine. She spoke of being dragged from a roadside near Richmond, bound, blindfolded and transported by wagon for days. She remembered the smell of pine sap and swamp, the creak of wagon wheels, and the voice of a woman, low, commanding, almost amused, ordering her to keep still or lose her tongue. When the blindfold was removed, Lydia found herself in a dark cellar where dozens of others sat chained to iron rings in the wall. There were children no older than 10, women with bruised faces, men whose eyes had long since gone empty. She was held there 5 months, half-starved, waiting to be sent south. She remembered the voice of a red-haired man, Elias Ward, who came to inspect her, muttering numbers like a merchant appraising cattle. Her salvation came through coincidence. One of Ward's drivers, angered by a dispute over payment, deserted and fled north. He told authorities of a holding place at Ward's Hollow. By the time riders arrived, the prisoners had been moved. But Lydia's story, written in shaky script on yellowed paper, spread through abolitionist circles and reached Mayor Wicks, who vowed to bring the woman called Margaret Doyle to justice. Yet justice was slow in those days, and Margaret's power was vast. The Hollow remained untouched, her tavern still busy, her wagons still rolling south under cover of darkness. The authorities had only rumors, no witnesses brave enough to speak, and a woman whose cruelty was matched only by her cunning. The buried chests unearthed by that farmer in 1829 would change everything. They were the silent confessions of years of blood. And from that soil, the legend of Margaret Doyle, the woman who fed on freedom, would finally begin to unravel. By 1821, the Hollow had become something unholy. On moonless nights, riders moved in silence across the Virginia-Carolina line, wagons groaning beneath the weight of the living. Inside those wagons were people whose names would never again be spoken. Children lulled with lies of new work, husbands taken from fields, mothers whose freedom papers had been torn and burned before their eyes. The wagons followed paths so old and narrow that even moonlight hesitated to enter them. At the end of those paths waited Margaret Doyle's house, the 2-story farmhouse where no one left the same way they came in. The house stood like a sentinel on the edge of pine forest and swamp, its windows shuttered as though to keep something from escaping. Beneath it, hidden behind false walls and narrow stairwells, Margaret had constructed chambers that the law would one day call holding cells. She called them her quiet rooms. Those rooms were never empty. The cries that rose from them, muffled by thick timbers, became the lullaby of Ward's Hollow. Neighbors heard strange sounds in the night, chains clinking, dogs howling, muffled sobs, and told themselves it was only the wind. Fear had taught the locals not to wonder aloud. Those who asked questions tended to vanish themselves. Margaret had perfected the art of blending legality with lawlessness. Her tavern, Ward's Rest, remained open to travelers. Soldiers, traders, and wanderers all passed through, filling her purse and her network of ears. The tavern cellar doubled as a prison for those unfortunate enough to be chosen, and her staff were as complicit as they were terrified. Some were willing participants, paid well in whiskey and silver. Others served under threat, their silence purchased by fear. The woman herself was no longer the rugged widow the borderlands had first known. By the 1820s, she was a matriarch of menace, a towering figure whose presence seemed to bend a room. Her hair, once black, now showed threads of gray, but her eyes had lost none of their severity. She carried a pistol at all times, often resting it on the tavern bar as if it were part of her anatomy. There were tales that she could lift a grown man off the ground by his throat, and though such stories blurred into legend, those who met her did not doubt her strength. Elias Ward remained her partner, her equal in cruelty but not in vision. He handled logistics, routes, buyers, contacts in New Orleans and Savannah. He had the mind of a merchant and the soul of a butcher. Together they formed a balance of intellect and savagery that made their operation unstoppable. Ward's charm masked his violence. He could dine with a preacher by day and slit a man's throat by night without changing expression. The men who worked for them came from every corner of desperation. Fugitives, drifters, and even a few enslaved men promised their freedom for service. Among these was a light-skinned man known only as Jonas, whose mixed ancestry allowed him to move undetected between worlds. He was the decoy, the scout who sought victims in cities and towns. Jonas would present himself as a free black laborer seeking work and befriend his targets, learning their routines and vulnerabilities. Then, when the time came, he would lure them toward the wagons waiting in the dark. It was Jonas who brought the first children to Margaret's cellar. He had found them near Petersburg, siblings aged 10 and 12, working for a small church school. He promised them steady pay and warm meals. When they failed to arrive home, the town searched for a day, then moved on. Their mother died within the year, never knowing what had become of them. Their small skeletons would later be found beneath the floorboards of Margaret Doyle's parlor. The Doyles and Wards made themselves untouchable through cunning geography. Ward's Rest sat precisely astride the state line. One doorway opened into Virginia, the other into Carolina. When sheriffs from either side came knocking, Margaret or Elias would simply step into the opposite room, declaring themselves outside that sheriff's jurisdiction. It was a loophole that turned the tavern into a sanctuary of crime. For years, the operation thrived unchecked. In 1824, however, their world darkened further. A rival trader from Georgia named Hollis Bell, a man of greed equal to theirs, arrived in the hollow carrying thousands in cash. Bell was a legitimate dealer in enslaved people and planned to buy new laborers along the coast. But he was also reckless. He drank openly, boasted of his wealth, and asked too many questions. To Margaret, he was both opportunity and threat. She welcomed him with feigned warmth, offering him a room at the tavern and endless whiskey. That night, while Bell slept, she and Elias entered quietly. Jonas later told how she carried the lantern herself, setting it on the table while Ward drew his knife. The trader awoke just as the blade touched his throat. He had time only to see Margaret's eyes, calm and unblinking, before darkness took him. His body was sealed in one of her wooden chests and buried at the edge of a cornfield. His horses and wagon were sold, his money divided among the gang. For nearly a decade afterward, the soil above him remained undisturbed, until that farmer's plow would find it years later. The profits from Bell's murder were enormous, but the consequences would echo louder. Unlike the countless black victims whose absences raised no alarm, Bell's disappearance was noticed. His partners in Georgia demanded answers, and the first whispers of suspicion reached officials in the Carolinas. Still, Margaret's reputation insulated her. Few believed that a woman, least of all a widow managing a tavern, could mastermind such brutality. Her cruelty deepened in proportion to her paranoia. She began killing within her own ranks. Anyone who threatened to speak or demanded too much share of the profits was found missing. The marshes surrounding Ward's Hollow became graves upon graves. The few who escaped told of nights filled with screams and the sharp, wet thud of shovels breaking ground. Among those caught in her orbit was a child named Samuel Price. He was 7 when Margaret bought him from a traveling trader, an orphan of mixed ancestry whose uncertain status made him easy to purchase and easier to control. She raised him inside her house, half servant, half possession. To outsiders, Samuel appeared favored. She dressed him better than the others and taught him to read scripture aloud, claiming he was a curiosity she kept for company. But beneath the veneer of kindness lay ownership of the cruelest kind. Margaret trained him as she did her dogs, through fear, through dependence. She told him she was his protector, that beyond her door lay men who would kill him for the color of his skin. She kept him close, forcing him to witness things a child should never see. He saw her pour poison into cups, drag bodies by their feet across the floor, bury infants who had cried too long. He learned to keep silent. As Samuel grew, she began using him in her schemes. His youth and innocence made him the perfect lure. She sent him to approach free black families on back roads, claiming to deliver messages or ask for water. When doors opened, her men followed. The child understood he was helping evil, but he also knew that refusal meant death. Survival became his only loyalty. By 1825, Margaret's network had expanded deep into the northern states. Her buyers in the south sent coded letters requesting parcels, and within weeks, those parcels arrived, bound and branded anew. Mayor Jonathan Wicks of Raleigh began tracking the pattern of disappearances. Free families vanishing between Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. His investigation, driven by moral outrage, soon revealed a chilling consistency. All roads led to the borderlands. Wicks offered rewards for information, $500 a fortune in those days. For the first time, tongues loosened. Former associates of the Doyle Ward gang, drunk or desperate, began to talk. Small details surfaced. A tavern straddling 2 states, a woman with iron-gray hair, wagons passing through the marsh at midnight. But even as pressure mounted, Margaret refused to retreat. She grew more violent, as though the blood itself had become her sustenance. Anyone suspected of betrayal vanished within days. The hollow soil turned darker, heavy with decay. Samuel, now nearly 16, felt the terror closing in. He had lived his whole life under her command, yet he knew she would kill him the moment she sensed weakness. It was around this time that he began to pray, not to God, whom he doubted had ever looked toward Ward's Hollow, but to the spirits his mother had once spoken of before dying. He prayed for deliverance, for vengeance, for anything that might end Margaret Doyle's reign. The year 1829 brought the first fracture. The farmer's discovery of the buried chest reached Sheriff Joseph Henson of Beaufort County, who arrived at the hollow with a small detachment. They found Margaret calm, smiling, her hands resting on the bar as though awaiting guests. When questioned, she claimed ignorance. She said her tenants had dug wells, that strangers sometimes crossed her land without permission. The sheriff, uneasy but lacking proof, left empty-handed, but Samuel knew what lay under that soil. He had helped dig those graves, and he knew more, names, dates, places, all carved into the back of his memory like tally marks. That night he made his decision. He would flee. Before dawn, he crept from the cellar where he slept, carrying only a flask of water and a small scrap of paper bearing the name Wicks. He had overheard it spoken by a drunk guard who cursed the mayor's bounty. To Samuel, the name meant salvation. He followed the river, moving north by night, hiding by day. It was nearly a week before riders caught him on a road outside Seaford. The men who seized him were lawmen, though he couldn't know it then. They took him in, questioning him under harsh light until at last he broke. What poured from him that day changed American criminal history. Samuel told them everything, how the tavern was built upon 2 states, how prisoners were kept in hidden cellars, how Margaret and Elias murdered rivals and buried them in boxes. He described the wooden chest he had helped seal, the same one found by the farmer's plow. His voice trembled as he spoke of children buried alive, of women beaten until silent. The officers who listened wrote furiously, unable to hide their disgust. When the boy finished, the sheriff stepped into the hallway and vomited. Samuel's testimony gave the law its first clear path into Ward's Hollow. Warrants were issued, and on a cold April morning, Officers from both states descended upon the Doyle property. What they unearthed defied belief. Boxes stacked in soil like coffins in a vault, each containing human remains. The smell was enough to drive strong men to their knees. The graves stretched far into the woods, too many to count. Margaret was arrested without resistance. She stood in her parlor as the officers entered, her pistol resting idly on the table, her expression unreadable. When they read the charges, she smiled faintly, as if amused that the world had finally caught up to her. By then, Elias Ward had vanished, likely fleeing south with the last of their money. His brother disappeared too, leaving Margaret alone to face the storm. They took her to the county jail in Georgetown, a crude stone building meant for debtors, not murderers. She was nearly 70, yet her strength unsettled the guards. She spoke little, spending her days in silence and her nights pacing the cell, whispering to no one. The people of the borderlands gathered in disbelief. For decades, the name Doyle had been both rumor and warning. Now the truth stood in shackles. The newspapers called her the she-devil of the crossroads, the queen of kidnappers, the murderess of Ward's Hollow. For the first time, the crimes that white society had ignored when their victims were black filled the front pages of their papers. But Margaret Doyle had one last secret to keep. The spring of 1829 brought with it a chill that lingered longer than any memory of winter. Across the lowlands near Ward's Hollow, rain fell without pause, turning the dirt roads into veins of brown water that snaked between the trees. But even the weather seemed to hush when the digging began. Sheriff Henson's men came with wagons, shovels, and lanterns. At first they thought they would find 1 or 2 graves, perhaps 3. But as the earth was turned, the number multiplied. Beneath the wet soil lay boxes, dozens of them, stacked like some grotesque harvest. The deeper they dug, the stronger the stench grew, until the air itself felt alive with death. Each chest was the same, hand-built, sealed tight, and large enough for a single body. Some held the remains of adults, others of children. A few contained 2 or 3 skeletons together, twisted into the angles of those who had struggled to breathe before the air ran out. The men stopped often to steady themselves, to gag, to pray. Every box they unearthed added weight to the story the boy, Samuel Price, had told them. He had led them there. The small, frightened young man, the one who had lived inside Margaret Doyle's house since childhood, became the guide to hell. His testimony matched every discovery. The broken skulls, the boxes buried near the corn patch, the child's body wrapped in linen and hidden beneath the garden. He named who had built the boxes, who had carried the bodies, and where Margaret had stood as they buried them. Samuel's words were quiet, but the details were merciless. He told them that Margaret killed not out of passion, but practicality. If a captive became sick or screamed too often, she considered it bad business. It was cheaper to silence the problem than to cure it. He described how she would stand with folded arms as Elias Ward and the others dragged the dying out to the yard. If the body twitched too long, she would finish it herself with a pistol shot. Sometimes, she killed without warning, children who reminded her of her own lost youth, men who looked at her too long, women who tried to pray. The sheriff listened to all of it. By the time the boy finished, the lawmen had stopped seeing him as a criminal's accomplice. They saw what he truly was, a child raised in the belly of the beast, enslaved by a woman who used fear as language. The investigation spread quickly across county lines. For the first time, Virginia and Carolina lawmen worked together, and within weeks even federal officials had arrived. Reporters came too, their boots sinking into the same mud that covered the graves. Their ink carried the tale across the nation. The butcher of Ward's Hollow exposed. Inside her jail cell in Georgetown, Margaret Doyle awaited her fate with a composure that unsettled everyone who saw her. The guard said she sat upright on her bunk each morning, brushing her hair with a comb she'd fashioned from a splinter of wood. When questioned, she spoke softly, almost sweetly, as though discussing the weather. At first, she denied everything. She called the graves the work of thieves, vagrants, enemies trying to frame her. But when they brought her the box uncovered from beneath her kitchen floor, the one containing the small skeleton of a child, something in her eyes flickered. Then she laughed. The sound chilled even the jailer who had once fought in war. It was not hysteria or madness. It was a laugh of memory, of recognition. That one, she whispered, was mine to deal with. The interrogations grew longer. Over time, she began to talk. The words came out in fragments, a chronology of horror spoken as if recounting old business. She confessed to killing at least 20 people herself, though others suspected more. She mentioned murders with the disinterest of someone describing the slaughter of livestock. She told of how her daughter Ellen had once wept when she struck a child too hard, and how she'd warned the girl never to show pity again. She spoke of Elias Ward as both partner and disappointment, a man too weak to do what must be done. Her jailers wrote down every word, struggling to keep pace. Some nights, they swore they heard her talking even when alone, holding conversations with the dead, or with something else entirely. In one of her few lucid reflections, she said, "A man kills for anger or greed, a woman kills for order." When asked what she meant, she only smiled. The grand jury convened in late April. 24 white men of the county, some farmers, some merchants, all grim-faced, heard the evidence presented by the Attorney General himself. For the first time, a white woman was being indicted for murdering people of color, 4 counts in total, each carrying the penalty of death. The charges were specific: an infant girl, a boy of 8, an adult man and another child, each murdered between 1820 and 1824. The remains had been identified only through Samuel's memory and the items buried with them: small buttons, scraps of cloth, a locket. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before signing the indictments. Margaret would hang. The news spread like wildfire. In towns across Delaware and Maryland, sermons were preached about her sins. Pamphlets sold for pennies, painting her as either devil or demon. The name Margaret Doyle became a curse mothers whispered to keep their children close at night. Yet in the jail, she seemed untouched by it all. Guards noticed how she never wept, never begged. Sometimes she paced in silence, other times she dozed for hours, murmuring names that no one recognized. The few women who cleaned the cells refused to enter hers alone, claiming they felt a pressure in the air, as if the walls themselves were listening. One night, a jailer named Isaac Beale claimed he awoke to the sound of someone humming inside her cell. When he looked through the grate, he saw her seated on the floor, rocking gently, eyes open but unseeing, the tune low and tuneless. It was the same lullaby, he said later, that mothers sang to quiet children in those parts. By May, the trial date was set. Reporters flooded Georgetown, preparing to witness the spectacle, but the trial never came. On the morning of May 11, 1829, when the guards came for their routine rounds, they found her lying on the floor. Her lips were blue, her hands clenched around a small vial hidden in her sleeve. The jail doctor examined her and pronounced the cause: arsenic poisoning. Whether smuggled by a sympathizer or hoarded from medicine given earlier, no one knew. She had ended her life 3 weeks before she was to face the gallows. For a woman who had controlled every soul in her reach, the manner of her death fit perfectly. Final, calculated, defiant. She had chosen the one act left beyond the law's control. Her death left the jail in chaos. Officials had prepared for the most public execution in Delaware's history, not a corpse in a cell. Some called her suicide a coward's act. Others said she had simply beaten the hangman to his task. But among those who had known her victims, the reaction was only sorrow. The dead could not speak for themselves, and now neither could she. Samuel Price, the boy who had escaped, was spared punishment. His cooperation had brought justice, and the governor himself signed the paper granting his freedom. Abolitionists from Pennsylvania arranged for his relocation under a new name, helping him vanish from the world that had enslaved him twice, once by chains and once by guilt. He would never again set foot in the borderlands, though whispers later claimed that a quiet man resembling him helped fugitives escape through safe houses in Maryland and Pennsylvania years later. If true, perhaps that was his penance. In the months following Margaret Doyle's death, investigators continued to uncover evidence of her crimes. The tally of those kidnapped and sold into slavery rose into the hundreds. Some records estimated as many as 1,000 souls had passed through her hands, sent south in chains, their lives erased for profit. The gang itself fractured. Elias Ward fled, likely to Alabama or Mississippi, where law enforcement could not reach. His name appeared in southern newspapers years later, linked to mysterious disappearances of slaves from rival traders. But no one ever proved it was him. His brother vanished entirely, absorbed into the same dark economy that had once made them rich. The community around Ward's Hollow never recovered. Farmers abandoned their land, unable to bear the proximity to the graves. The tavern was torn down by locals who feared it cursed, though the cellar remained, filled with mud and bones that refused to stay buried. Children grew up hearing stories that at night, lights could still be seen moving beneath the ground. Margaret's body was buried in the jail yard without ceremony. No family claimed her remains. When the prison was later rebuilt in the 20th century, her bones were disinterred, and her skull was displayed for decades in local collections, a grotesque relic of the region's most infamous criminal. People came to stare, to marvel, to imagine the monster that had once lived behind those hollow sockets. It was as if the community that had ignored her crimes in life needed to keep her as spectacle in death. But her true legacy was far less tangible and far more terrifying. Margaret Doyle proved that evil did not always wear the face of a man, that it could nest quietly behind the facade of domestic life. She existed not as an anomaly but as a symptom of greed, of racism, of a world that turned away from suffering when it belonged to those deemed lesser. The historians who later chronicled her case found in her story something larger than one woman's depravity. They found evidence of a society that allowed a business of kidnapping to flourish unchecked for decades, hidden behind legal loopholes and willful blindness. The so-called reverse underground railroad she led was the mirror image of freedom's most sacred network. Where others risked their lives to deliver the enslaved toward liberty, Margaret Doyle's empire dragged them back into bondage. Her story became a dark reflection of America's own contradictions. A nation that proclaimed liberty while building fortunes on human misery. Those who study her crimes say she operated too long, too successfully for her to have acted alone. There were others, merchants, ship captains, politicians, who profited quietly from her trade. Their names were never exposed, and perhaps that is the most haunting truth of all. She was not an aberration but a cog in a vast hidden machine. In the end, her death brought no peace to the borderlands. Even now, the locals claim that on certain nights, when the air turns heavy and the river runs low, you can hear faint knocking beneath the fields near where her house once stood. Some say it's the sound of roots shifting through old wooden boxes. Others swear it's something else, ghosts trying to dig their way out. Whatever truth lies buried in that soil, it carries the same message that Sheriff Henson wrote in his final report before he retired. Evil does not rise suddenly. It grows in the silence of those who refuse to see it. The silence around Ward's Hollow had lasted almost 20 years, and when it finally broke, it revealed a darkness that could never again be covered by soil. When the woman called Margaret Doyle drew her final breath inside that stone cell, the law believed her story had ended. But death does not close a wound that deep, it only seals the infection beneath. What she left behind was not simply a trail of bodies or an empire of crime. It was a silence, heavy and enduring, that crept through the borderlands long after her bones were laid beneath the jail yard clay. The investigation that followed her death dragged on for months. Officials from Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia met in smoke-filled rooms, passing between them the same question no one could answer. How had she survived so long? How had a network that enslaved hundreds operated in plain sight for nearly 20 years without anyone stopping it? The truth was simple and shameful. Margaret Doyle had not hidden her evil from the world. The world had chosen not to see it. The people of Ward's Hollow had grown used to her presence, to the wagons creaking through the night, to the faces that vanished and were never spoken of again. Some were complicit through profit, others through fear, But most were guilty of the same thing, apathy. The lawmen digging through her estate found ledgers scrawled in her own hand, neat columns of numbers and initials. Each mark represented a human being. One column for the price paid, another for the sum earned upon delivery. She had been meticulous in her cruelty, documenting every soul as if they were livestock. Scholars later estimated that between 500 and 1,000 people had passed through her network, sold back into bondage in the Deep South. Each name had been erased, replaced by a value: 800, 100, 900, a life reduced to arithmetic. The deeper investigators delved, the clearer it became that Margaret Doyle's reach had extended far beyond the swamp and pine forests of the borderlands. Letters discovered in her home bore the names of merchants in Charleston, Savannah, and New Orleans, men of wealth who purchased parcels without asking where they came from. It was a system built not on secrecy but on convenience, a dark mirror of the legal trade that still flourished under American law. When word of these discoveries reached Philadelphia, it ignited outrage among abolitionists. Newspaper editorials demanded that the federal government confront what one writer called a commerce of stolen souls. Yet others dismissed the affair as the isolated madness of a monstrous woman, unwilling to admit how many hands had turned the same wheel. The governor of Delaware ordered that every property once owned by Doyle be searched. The teams that arrived found ruins, houses stripped of valuables, cellars filled with stagnant water. In the tavern's foundation, they uncovered chains bolted to the stone, iron rings stained with rust, and something darker. In the corner of one cellar, a section of the wall gave way to reveal a passage leading nowhere, just a dead end of brick and earth. The investigators sealed it again, preferring not to imagine what it once held. When they reached the main house, they found the place half collapsed, the roof sagging like a broken spine. Birds nested in the rafters, and the hearth was filled with old ashes. On the second floor, one of the men noticed faint carvings on the wooden wall, initials etched by small uncertain hands. Some letters were familiar to Samuel Price, who had returned once under escort to point out where he'd lived. The boy traced one set of initials with his fingers and whispered, "Lydia." He said no more. By summer, the graves were counted and the reports written. The officials who had come from Washington packed their trunks and left, but the locals remained, trapped among the ghosts. The land itself seemed changed. Crops failed, animals sickened, storms lingered longer over the fields. People began to whisper that the soil had turned sour, poisoned by what it had consumed. Superstition filled the space where justice had ended. Travelers told of strange lights drifting through the trees near the Doyle property, of voices echoing from the ground after rain. Some claimed to see the figure of a tall woman walking the boundary between Virginia and Carolina, her hands red to the wrist, her face veiled by mist. The town fathers of the region decided to act, not out of piety, but out of fear for their reputation. Ward's Hollow was renamed Reliance, an attempt to wash away its past. Maps were redrawn, property lines adjusted, and the old tavern road was left to rot until the swamp reclaimed it. But names are only words, and words cannot bury memory. Decades passed, and still the story of Margaret Doyle haunted the area. Farmers found bone fragments when they tilled the earth. Children dared each other to walk the fields at night, listening for the whisper of chains beneath their feet. Church sermons spoke of her as a warning, though none dared utter her name aloud. Yet beyond folklore, her story reached further than anyone in the Hollow could imagine. The abolitionist movement seized upon her crimes as evidence of a greater sickness in the nation's soul. Pamphlets circulated through northern cities describing her as the Witch of the Border, a woman whose evil was made possible by the moral rot of slavery itself. One broadside, published in 1832, claimed she had captured not less than 800 free souls and sold them into darkness, calling her a mirror to America's hypocrisy. Ironically, it was her atrocities that helped awaken new conscience in those who had long ignored the plight of free black citizens. Her story became a rallying cry for those who demanded that the laws protecting slavery be dismantled altogether. In that sense, even her wickedness had consequences she never intended, but for the people who had lived under her shadow, no redemption followed. The few surviving victims who had escaped the reverse railroad were scattered across states, their testimonies fading into rumor. Some tried to rebuild lives, others disappeared altogether. Consumed by the trauma of what they had endured, Samuel Price, the boy whose testimony had ended her empire, vanished into anonymity after his relocation. Rumors claimed he worked on the legitimate Underground Railroad years later, helping fugitives find freedom. Some said he guided them through the same river channels that once carried captives south. Whether out of penance or justice, he became a ghost of redemption, haunting the same landscape where evil had ruled. In the early 1840s, a traveling journalist named George Townsend visited Reliance to write an account of the Doyle case. He found little more than ruins and reluctance. The locals avoided his questions, eyes darting toward the woods when he spoke her name. One old man finally muttered that she never truly died, that she'd simply changed form. The devil takes care of his own. Townsend walked the fields where the graves had been found and noted how the air seemed colder there, even under full sun. He wrote that the wind carried a sound like breathing from beneath the ground. When his article was published, readers dismissed it as Gothic exaggeration, but those who had been to Reliance nodded quietly. Time turned Margaret Doyle from history into myth. Her name was used to frighten children, her story adapted into dime novels and penny serials. Some depicted her as a witch who drank the blood of her victims, others as a tragic figure, driven mad by the cruelty of men. In truth, she had been neither, just a woman who learned too well how the world worked and used its cruelty to her advantage. By the 1860s, when the Civil War tore the nation apart, few remembered her by name. But the system she had exploited, the trafficking, the human greed, the blindness, was still alive in different forms. The land where her tavern once stood became a thoroughfare for soldiers, and some swore that on quiet nights, amid the gunfire and screams, they could hear laughter carried on the wind. When peace returned, the area never quite recovered. The soil remained restless, the people wary. Generations grew up knowing only that something terrible had once rooted itself there, something that would not stay buried. They built churches and schools, trying to overwrite the land's memory with hymns and learning, but the stories clung like mold to damp wood. Historians later called Margaret Doyle a product of her times, a phrase that does nothing to ease the horror she caused. Others called her a demon in human form, as though evil could be explained by anything other than choice. But perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. She was both, a reflection of the society that bred her and a willful architect of its darkest impulses. Even death failed to erase her entirely. In 1920, when the old jail in Georgetown was torn down, workmen unearthed her coffin. Someone, perhaps out of morbid curiosity, removed her skull. For decades it passed through hands and institutions, a relic of infamy displayed at fairs, museums, even libraries. People stared at the hollow sockets that once watched human lives dissolve. They said her skull was larger than most, as if to justify the scale of her madness. Eventually it was stored in a private collection, its location uncertain, its story continuing like an echo. Those who saw it claimed the bone seemed discolored, tinged faintly red. No one wanted to admit that perhaps the color came from the soil itself, the same cursed ground that had fed on her victims. Every few decades, her name returns like a splinter working its way to the surface. Books are written, scholars debate her motives, and filmmakers borrow her legend for tales of Southern Gothic horror. Yet each retelling forgets something vital, that she was real, that her victims were real, and that evil often thrives not in monsters, but in ordinary people left unchallenged. The people of Reliance still avoid the field where her house once stood. Grass grows unevenly there, and animals refuse to graze near the old foundation stones. On humid nights, fog drifts low and thick, and the faint shape of a building seems to reappear, just for a moment, before vanishing again. Some locals claim it's an illusion of heat, others a trick of memory. But those who've stood there in silence swear they can hear a faint rhythm under the soil, like the thudding of a heartbeat long buried but never stopped. And so the story of Margaret Doyle remains both history and haunting, a testament to what the world can ignore when cruelty becomes routine, and a warning of how evil seeps into the cracks left by indifference. The records show that she died alone, unrepentant, but in the places she ruled, where the swamp still breathes and the night still hums with unseen life, her shadow lingers. The earth remembers what it was forced to swallow. Long after the gallows were dismantled and her name was buried under layers of new maps and new lies, Margaret Doyle remained in the marrow of the borderlands. Her death had closed a chapter, but her story never truly ended. The fields that once concealed her crimes grew back their grass. The tavern rotted into the swamp, and the world moved on, pretending not to remember. Yet every generation something happened to stir her back into conversation. A discovery, a whispered tale, an unearthed bone. Evil does not die easily. It changes its clothes and waits. The decades following her suicide reshaped the country she had once exploited. The abolitionist movement gathered strength, using her case as a dark testament to the fragility of freedom. Pamphlets printed in northern cities recounted her crimes in trembling detail. Hundreds kidnapped, buried, sold, erased. Her story was not told to horrify, but to awaken, to prove that slavery's shadow extended far beyond the plantations, into the backyards of those who believed themselves untouched. But in the South, people spoke differently. They dismissed her as an outlier, a deranged woman whose wickedness did not represent them. The hypocrisy was thick enough to choke on. Her customers had been planters, brokers, ship captains, men who dined in fine houses and prayed under gilded roofs. None of them faced justice. History, ever polite to power, forgot their names. By the late 19th century, the world remembered her less as a criminal and more as a myth. Folklore softened her edges, turned her into a spectral legend that haunted the marshlands. Mothers in Virginia warned misbehaving children that old Doyle will get you if you wander too far. Writers transformed her from a human monster into a ghost story, a morality tale stripped of its truth. But for those who had read the court documents or touched the relics unearthed from her land, there was no need for invention. The facts alone were horror enough. One of those men was Professor Edwin Raines, a historian from Maryland who visited Reliance in 1893. He found the locals reluctant to speak, but willing to sell fragments of the past. Rusted shackles, a pistol said to have been hers, even a wooden ring taken from the tavern beams. Whether real or counterfeit hardly mattered. Raines wrote in his notes that the air around her old property felt heavy, as if the earth itself retained memory. When he examined the official records in Georgetown, Raines discovered a transcript of Samuel Price's deposition, the only surviving first-hand account from within her house. It was written in shaky, uneven script, dictated by a boy who could barely read his own words. In that fragile handwriting, the historian found not confession, but testimony. Samuel had described the faces of the captives, a woman named Ruth, a boy called Henry, a family taken from Delaware who had sung hymns every night until Margaret forbade it. He spoke of children being renamed before being sold, their old identities burned away like waste paper. He told of one girl, barely 12, who refused to stop praying aloud. Margaret, furious, struck her with an iron poker and ordered the others to bury her in the garden before dawn. The depositions made Raines ill. He left his notes unfinished and never published his findings. In his last letter before his death, he wrote only, "Some truths should remain unread aloud." But history has a way of resurfacing, even when buried by fear. In the early 1900s, relic hunters began exploring the fields near the old Doyle property. They found fragments, nails, a rusted locket, bones small enough to belong to a child. The discoveries reignited public fascination, and newspapers once again printed her name. A local fair even displayed her skull, labeled the head of the murderess Margaret Doyle. People queued to see it, laughing nervously, as if staring into evil could somehow cleanse them of it. The display traveled from county fairs to libraries, sometimes resting for years in dusty cabinets before reappearing in new hands. In every town it drew crowds. But for the black residents of those towns, it was not curiosity. It was insult. They knew that the real horror had not been her madness, but the world that had allowed her to exist at all. As the 20th century advanced, Margaret's legend twisted into something cinematic. Authors reimagined her as a gothic villainess, and filmmakers used her tale as backdrop for ghost stories of women cursed by sin. None captured the plain, brutal truth that she was not cursed, not possessed, not insane. She was ordinary, her evil rooted in logic, greed, and the certainty that the people she killed did not matter. Her ghost, though, never seemed to rest. Travelers claimed that at night, when the fog rolled over the borderland marshes, they could see the outline of a woman in a tattered shawl walking the boundary between two states. Dogs howled when she passed. Some swore they heard knocking beneath the soil after rainstorms, as though the earth were remembering the bodies it had once swallowed. Whole. One story came from a preacher who stopped by the area in 1928. He spent a night near the old tavern foundations and awoke to find handprints pressed into the wet mud outside his tent. Small, child-sized handprints arranged in a circle. No one believed him, but he left before sunset and never returned. It's tempting to dismiss these accounts as folklore, as the region's way of translating guilt into haunting. But in some sense, perhaps the hauntings were deserved. Places that have witnessed such systematic cruelty should never be peaceful. Over time, the earth reclaimed most traces of her empire. The cornfields gave way to pine again, and the roads she used for her trade became faint trails leading nowhere. The tavern site is marked now only by a historical plaque erected decades ago, its text polite, its tone measured. It calls her a notorious figure associated with the reverse Underground Railroad. A description so calm it borders on denial. The plaque does not mention the children buried alive. It does not mention the sound of chains echoing through the cellar or the laughter that followed. It does not mention that for almost 20 years, no one cared enough to stop her. Yet beneath that tidy summary, the soil still holds the truth. Archaeologists who surveyed the site in the 1980s reported anomalous readings, dense clusters of organic material deep underground. They did not dig. They said it was out of scope. The local elders tell another story. They say the land refuses to be built upon. Every attempt to raise a new foundation collapses. Machinery breaks. Workers fall ill. So the ground lies empty still, a green scar across the map, unhealed and unforgotten. In classrooms and archives, Margaret Doyle's name occasionally resurfaces, treated as a footnote in the history of slavery. But her story deserves more than footnotes. It deserves discomfort. Because her cruelty wasn't isolated. She was the symptom of a disease the nation refused to name. The conviction that some lives held value only as property. Every ledger she kept, every coin she earned, was made possible by that shared belief. The people who ate at her tavern and ignored the muffled cries beneath the floorboards were not monsters. They were ordinary citizens, just unwilling to look down. That is the truest horror of her tale. The normalcy of complicity. Samuel Price's descendants, if any survived, left no record. But some abolitionist letters mention a man fitting his description helping fugitives cross the Mason-Dixon line years later. They called him the boy who unburied the truth. His name faded, but his act remained. The moment one frightened child tore open the silence of an entire region. Today, the town of Reliance is quiet, little more than a crossroads of farmland and shadow. Tourists rarely visit, except for the rare historian or curious traveler who's heard whispers of the Devil Widow. They find only a marker, a patch of uneven soil, and an uneasy stillness. But those who linger at dusk sometimes claim to hear faint singing, voices rising and falling like distant wind through reeds. No one recognizes the melody. Some say it's the song of those she buried, finally answered by the living. What remains of Margaret Doyle is not just a ghost story, it is a mirror. It reflects what a society can tolerate when profit outweighs compassion, when law bends to prejudice, when silence becomes survival. Her life reminds us that evil rarely begins with monsters. It begins with the permission of good people doing nothing. So when you stand before the old field, if you ever do, listen carefully. The land hums low as if whispering names long forgotten. You might feel a chill rise from the soil, a subtle vibration beneath your feet. It is not the wind. It is memory, centuries of it, refusing to rest. And if you listen long enough, you might hear another sound beneath the hum. Not the laughter of the woman who ruled there, but the heartbeat of all those she tried to erase. It beats still, faint but defiant, echoing across generations. Because stories like hers never truly end. They survive to remind us what happens when the human soul is sold too cheaply, when justice sleeps too long, and when the earth itself must become the witness. This was the tale of Margaret Doyle. Once flesh and blood, now legend and warning. Her name may fade from books, her house may rot into mud, but the ground remembers. It always does.